Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Joseph Ryder Anderson podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Anderson himself, and today we have something a little bit different to go over. If you're a fan of this podcast, you probably know that I talk about Union Arena quite a bit, and I talk a little bit too much about Sword Art Online decks. So, while I've said that I'm probably not going to do much more content on Sword Art Online until Volume 2 comes out for Union Arena, I am today talking about a side quest that I've been on for the last couple months, and that side quest has to do with the Sword Art Online anime and greater universe. So after a couple months of getting into Sword Art Online and learning everything there is to know about it, watching all the shows, I did complete the light novel series, which is the source material for Sword Art Online, and I did read that from volumes 19 through 27, which is essentially the story that takes place after where the anime left off. And yes, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about a complete review and overview of everything that's happened in the story, or at least not everything. I shouldn't say everything, but the highlights in the story from basically everything that's happened in Unital Ring, which is the final arc past where the anime left off. I don't know that it's the final arc in Sword Art Online. I don't think anyone's committed to this being the final arc, but it is the next big arc. There is Cradle, which is sort of like a side story in between the anime Alicization arc. I shouldn't say anime, but the Alicization arc and this arc. And yeah, this is a pretty crazy arc. I think before getting into the review itself, I will say I am a little bit of a latecomer or a late bloomer in the Sword Art Online universe because I actually did not watch Sword Art Online when it originally came out. I do remember it being a big deal, but I did not actually watch it myself, and I really wish I had, because I would have loved to have followed it along with the anime as it was coming out. But I will say that having watched it later, it's already been out over 10 years at this point, and having come to the series later, I was able to kind of get a more of a holistic vision for what this story is all about. I think a lot of people who joined the fandom early may have been a bit disenchanted with some of the twists and turns it took away from maybe the kinds of story they thought it would be or wanted it to be. But I didn't really have that because I was able to see all 3 seasons that are out in the anime at once, essentially. And I got a better idea of what the story was all about and where it was going. And I really liked it, especially since the show, it feels like the show and the story really doesn't come into its own until you get to the 3rd season. I feel like that's, in a weird way, everything until the 3rd season is just setting up the world that we're in. And the 3rd season is really where we get to where the story is meant to go. So with all that being said, I really wanted to read ahead in the light novels. And I was a little surprised to find out that they were light novels. I didn't know that anime is sometimes or frequently based off of light novels. I also didn't know that light novels were such a big deal in Japan, which is really cool. As something about me is that Joseph Ryder Anderson didn't start as a TCG site, right? That's why it's called Joseph Ryder, is that I have a writing background and a reading. I've read a lot, obviously, and a writing background. And so the website started as more of a reviews about pop culture and books and things like that, and articles on writing, and eventually evolved into a TCG site, which sounds kind of funny, but it was a very natural process. And so getting into these novels very much feels like getting back to my roots. I was actually although I was a little surprised when the book came in the mail. I think that was volume 19, which is the Cradle. I was a little surprised to find it to be a book, but I was also pleasantly surprised because in some ways it's easier for me to get into a novel than it is to a manga, as much as I do also enjoy mangas. Now, getting back to the main story. So my first impressions, I really thought that I dove first into Cradle, and I think one thing that really drew me to Cradle is I was probably like anyone who's a big fan of Asuna and Kirito. I think the Kirito Asuna relationship is a big driver for a lot of fans of Sword Art Online because it's just such a beautiful relationship and very relatable. Especially, I can totally relate to that relationship as a romantic myself. And I think that I was kind of hoping to get a lot of insight into what Kirito and Asuna were doing during their 200 years in the underworld. Speaking of which, spoilers for anyone who hasn't read past the anime, we're going to be covering all the basically spoilers from everything that's happened in Unital Ring so far. So that's up to you whether or not you want to proceed. But if you've seen the anime, you remember that Asuna and Kirito are in the underworld for 200 years, but I think it ends up being like essentially 5 minutes or so in the real world. It's not a very long space of time. And they wake up from that, get their memories erased. So they essentially don't remember anything that happened there. But they did a lot in the underworld. And so I'm very curious, especially with how the anime ended, where all of a sudden the underworld's like super advanced and they're in spaceships. It's like, well, what were Kirito and Asuna doing there? And I think that Moon Cradle lets that down a little bit because they don't really let you know. They let you know a few things. The story does not take place very long past where the anime left off. It's alluded to in the anime that Kirito and Asuna eventually would become the Star King and Queen. We don't see that. They're just sort of like government officials to some extent in the Moon Cradle arc. And the Moon Cradle arc in general doesn't actually follow Kirito and Asuna all that much. We do get a couple of chapters solely devoted to Kirito and Asuna, which are very rewarding for fans. But for the most part, it's a story about Ranye and Tisei. That's mostly what Moon Cradle's about, and especially Ranye. She's like a really big focus to that story. And I think another thing about that story is it really dives into her feelings for Kirito. And we do get this interesting insight to Asuna where she basically is kind of narrating, third person narrating she can tell that Ranye is having these strong feelings for Kirito, and we actually get an insight into her personality and her mind, her thought process, where she knows that there's these other characters or other people that Kirito's met along the way, these other female characters that have these really intense relationships with him. The books are very clear that Asuna is Kirito's one big relationship, and he clearly feels that way about her. I feel like the anime is slightly more ambiguous about this, but it's very clear in the books that Asuna and Kirito are the thing, and that the other females respect that. Although I think Alice respects it the least, but there's obviously contextual reasons for that, where she hasn't really known Kirito in the context of Asuna being around. But it's interesting to see that she sees that Ranye is feeling this way about Kirito, and so she basically commits to telling Ranye, how, like, confronting her about it, helping her through it, instead of just suffering silently for her the way she's done with these other female characters. So I thought that was an interesting insight into Asuna. But otherwise, yeah, Moon Cradle's a little bit, there's a ton of interesting world building. We learn a lot about the underworld, and we definitely see some important things starting. But yeah, it's not like super heavy on the main character's side of thing. Anyways, moving on from that, when we get into Unital Ring, so that Unital Ring 1, I kind of thought that it was going to dive headfirst into more of the stuff like going on in the underworld. And it was interesting to see that actually we don't dive headfirst into the underworld. Instead, we get to explore this new world called Unital Ring, and it's like a convergence, hence the Unital. So it's a convergence of all these different worlds, some that we've already been to, some that we haven't, right? And all these worlds built on the seed nexus coming together into one single world. And this world is the most sort of gritty, realistic world, other than the underworld. The underworld's more realistic, actually, but from the more game worlds, the underworld's more of like an alternate reality, whereas from all the game worlds like SAO, etc., it's a very realistic, like, don't starve survival game kind of a situation. And it's kind of ingenious that they do this, because it feels almost like a reboot And I guess this is the first story that's taking place that wasn't part of the original stories written for the online novel. So I guess in a way it is almost sort of like a reboot of Sword Art Online. And we get to, instead of going with Kirito at his most powerful, the way a lot of shonen stories do, right? Like a lot of shonen stories have a lot of power, the main character gets more and more powerful. The battles turn into more and more like just the good guy and bad guy nuking each other with their abilities. But instead, we kind of strip everything down to its most basic form. So Kirito loses all of this power, loses all of his stats. He's at level 1. He can't even, he doesn't have the power to carry the weapons and armor he's already wearing. So he's literally in his underwear for the whole first book, pretty much. And at the same time, the story gets stripped down too. All of a sudden, we're not talking about civilizations being destroyed or people dying. It's all about Asuna and Kirito working together closely to save their log cabin. So their log cabin is essentially fallen from the sky from New Aincrad to the ground, and it's in bad shape. There's enemies all around in the form of these monsters that they're under level to stop. And Kirito and Asuna are just trying to save their log cabin. So I really like that. It sort of feels simple in a way, but it's very human. It's like that desire and drive to just protect your home, right? The log cabin's something that fans have known about and seen Kirito and Asuna in since the very beginning of Sword Art Online. So there's a lot of emotional weight there in that. And we also get to see Kirito and Asuna working together in the game world, essentially for the first time since before Alicization. So in Alicization, they are together, and we do see this in Moon Cradle 2 a little bit, but this is the first time that they're really working hand in hand the way they have done in Aincrad and other arcs. So it's really kind of fulfilling that way to see these two back together facing these odds. And it's also really cool to see Kirito again try to figure out, how do I deal with these intense things going on, using his adaptability and his mind. How does he overcome these obstacles, like this bear that he ends up fighting, having nothing but his underwear, or these player killers that face him in the end, facing them down. They're fully armored up and with their swords and their gear, and he's got a stone knife, right? So how does he deal with these situations? That's part of the really the huge intrigue of this story. It's just stripping everything down to its most basic form. And then in the end, we do get introduced to two characters that are alluded to being pretty big characters moving forward in the story. And that's this Kimura Shikimi character who comes to the returnee school, and then Argo the Rat, who is a character we all know from the Aincrad days. And that's, again, bringing back Argo is just another way that Sword Art Online kind of keeps that continuity going. The story is really good at bringing back characters and themes that have been present all along to really create that feeling of resonance and the feeling of this is being a real world with the relationships and everything that go on. So it's a fantastic opening story, action-packed from start to finish, and it really sets up what this story is going to be about. It also is definitely more of a callback to some of the earlier times of Sword Art Online, especially kind of like Aincrad, kind of like the season 2 stuff that's going on. There's a little bit more levity than there was in the pure underworld story. It's kind of getting back to some more of that sort of style of storytelling that was present in some of the earlier seasons. Not that the storytelling in Alicization wasn't fantastic, it was, but I think that story almost existed in its own realm because of how different the underworld is from all the other game worlds, whereas Unital Ring functions much more like the game worlds we saw before that. And the characters can easily flit in and out of the two worlds, so that brings sort of, again, there's nobody's gonna get killed necessarily if they die in the game. If you die in Unital Ring, you can't come back into Unital Ring, but you're not gonna get hurt in the real world. So there is a lighter feeling to this story, which I think lends itself to what's going on and helps us explore some of the characters in a different way than just them facing certain death or these really extreme situations. Moving on to number 2. So number 2 is not as strong as number 1. I think the biggest draw of this book is we do get to see a lot of Sinon. So people who are fans of Sinon, she has a lot of time devoted to her. And again, she's trying to struggle and figure out how to make it in this world on her own, which kind of fits her character, right? So she's trying to figure out how to deal with this world on her own, separated from her main weapons. I think the coolest thing she does is she does face down this massive dinosaur and beats it and manages to up level pretty high. But yeah, that's the main thing. We also do also see an epic battle at the end, where Kirito and Asuna and team, they're all working together to defend the town that they've built. So now it's not just their log cabin, but it's this broader town that they're working towards building, which is going to be a huge theme in Unital Ring in general. But it's really not until Unital Ring 3, which is volume 24, that the story really starts to pick up. So Unital Ring 3 and 4, volumes 24 and 25, these are the strongest volumes so far in the Unital Ring arc. And in these two, the action is just peak for both Unital Ring and the Underworld. So as in the volume 3, Kirito goes back into the Underworld, and that sort of sets up what's going to be happening for the rest of these books to date. Is we're going to be splitting essentially most of our time between the Underworld and the Unital Ring world, and seeing like the different drama going on in those two worlds. And I think in volumes or in Unital Ring 3, Unital Ring 4, the action is pretty much just as exciting in the Unital Ring as it is in the Underworld. And it's just so what happens is you're just non-stop excitement throughout the entirety of these books. So we do see Kirito, Asuna, and Alice go back to the Underworld. And it's really interesting because the last time we saw the Underworld, it looked very different. You know, it was like essentially medieval society. And whereas now when we're going into the world 200 plus years later, it looks completely different. People are flying around in spaceships. There's a lot of modern technology, and I think that's going to be really interesting to see that too portrayed in the anime. I think there's a lot of cool stylization that they can do, but it is really interesting seeing Kirito back in action. There's a lot of this like legend and stuff around the Star King, and he is the Star King, but he doesn't remember being the Star King. So it's almost like he's kind of like having to reclaim this this sort of grand title and kingship that he had. But he's, just his regular old self, and he finds all that super silly. We do also get to meet some of the descendants of some of our favorite characters from the Underworld arcs, the Alicization arc. We get to meet some of those descendants, and we do get introduced into this very enigmatic Aolin character who looks a lot like Yu-Gi-Oh! And he's in charge of the Integrity Pilots, who essentially take over from the Integrity Knights. So that's really exciting. And at the same time that all that's going on in the Underworld, we're also building up towards a huge confrontation in the Unital Ring. So we do get introduced to this Mutasina character, and she looks a lot like that Kamura Shikimi character that we got introduced to earlier. It's not, I don't think it's ever stated yet in the stories that they're the same people, but if you just look at their pictures, they look very similar. Mutasina is essentially this beautiful, powerful woman who is kind of eerily a match for Kirito in the power of their minds. So Kirito's biggest strength is actually his mind and his adaptability. And Mutasina is so scary because she's kind of on par with him. And so she uses her cleverness and her deceit and her strategy to essentially enslave like 100 players to her using this noose of the accursed. And she actually, in the process of doing this, she's doing this to gather an army to actually go and take on Kirito, because everybody seems to know who Kirito is. His fame is spread, and so everyone wants to take him out before he can essentially conquer Unital Ring. Unital Ring is sort of set up as a world where only like one can survive, kind of a thing. So it's sort of a very dog eat dog kind of world. At the same time, you have to form alliances in order to succeed, because because if it's a survival game, you need a really strong resource line and logistical line to get anywhere. So So Mutasuina is essentially trying to gather up a bunch of people to go and conquer Kirito, and Kirito gets this news of the accursed. It's kind of freaky because even though it's just a virtual game, he feels like when it's cast, like he's being like strangled. So, and there's some evidence that it might actually be affecting him physically as well outside of the game. But it's definitely a huge like cliffhanger that this happens, and you're really wondering like, oh, how's Kirito going to get out of this one, right? But Mutasuina is definitely a strong character. She's one of the stronger villains we've seen. She's the first big villain of the Unital Ring arc, and she's one of the stronger villains that we've seen in general, especially since she's got such a powerful mind for tactics and strategy. So moving on into Unital Ring 4, which is volume 25, and this one really to me feels like the mid-season finale for Unital Ring. I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but there's just so much that comes to a head. Really, the whole opening movement of the Unital Ring story kind of comes to a head in this arc. We see Kirito and Asuna facing off against this big centipede monster, which is essentially the same monster that they faced on the 75th floor of Aincrad, only he looks a little bit different now. He's a little more fleshed out. But the two of these, this is one of my favorite fights, actually, because we get to see Kirito and Asuna finally battle together again, the way that they did in like the original Aincrad days, and in a way that we haven't seen them fight hand in hand since the Ordinal Scale movie, where these two are just going at it with this big monster, and they're so in tune. And I love the way that the author kind of portrays their growth and relationship through how much more closely they work together in this battle. They're just so in sync with one another battling this monster. But that's not even like the biggest fight, right? That's like more of the traditional boss fight that we see in Sword Art Online. But the biggest fight is the battle of wills that happens at the end between Mutasuina and Kirito, and these two really come head to head. They're both trying to outmaneuver each other, and it ends up just being kind of like a cat and mouse game. I think the thing that reminds me the most of it is probably like a Sherlock Holmes versus Moriarty situation, where they're both trying to outthink each other, and it just comes to head in such an intriguing and interesting way. And Yui plays a huge role in how the outcome of that battle goes. So you really feel for Kirito and Asuna, everyone who's facing Mutasuina down, and Mutasuina does end up losing the fight, but certainly she does not lose the war, and she will be back. We'll see more of her in later volumes. Another interesting subplot, I did not mention this, but one of my favorite little sub stories going on in Unital Ring is something as simple as Kirito's just trying to find like a present for Asuna. He's just trying to figure out what kind of a present to get for Asuna. They're pretty like established at this point. She's like 19, he's turning 18 soon, so things are probably feeling at that age. I think you're starting to think a little more seriously about your relationships, and they've just been together and they've been through so much, so he can't really figure out like what present to get her. So but we do see that come to fruition and him give her the present, and then we also get to see a nice little celebration for Asuna in their log cabin, which is definitely like a moment of like peace right before the storm that is the final battle between Kirito and Fam against Mutasuina to protect themselves and everyone inside their growing town. That really is where the action comes to a head. We do also then dive back into the underworld, and things are progressing there, and the story does end on a cliffhanger where we get to see some of our favorite characters, Ranye and Tisei, coming back. Not really coming back, but they're frozen, so we get to see them frozen, sealed away on the upper levels of the Central Cathedral. Of course, in the next book, Kirito has to set off on a mission to Admina, which is like the other planet that they travel to and have a civilization on. And he goes there to partly at Eolin's big request, but also to find this magic formula that he can use to bring back the Integrity Knights that were frozen, so Ranye and Tisei and Selka. So he goes there, and what ends up happening is he witnesses a bunch of things are going on. He kind of witnesses like this shady plot, but apart from that, he gets to witness this epic battle between Aolin and this newcomer bad guy named Isar, who is sort of like a former acquaintance of Aolin's. They've battled it out in the past. They're rivals. Aolin beat Isar in this big competition, and we get to see them duke it out. And again, one thing about Aolin is that he actually, despite being really young, he has power levels that are well beyond what the Integrity Knights had, like the strongest Integrity Knights had back in the day. So this guy's on a whole nother level than we've seen. He's not on the level of Kirito, but he's on a whole nother level from what we've seen before. And so watching him duke it out with E-Star, who's essentially on the same playing field as him, although it seems like Aerolin has some kind of mysterious like ailment or something. So E-Star probably, because of that, is a little bit more like, has a little more durability. So these two guys are going at it. And at the same time, Asuna and Kirito and Alice get to battle again. So we get to see them all work together, which is really exciting. But the biggest payoff of the story is actually when we get to see Ranye and Tisei come back to life and Selka come back to life. So that's really exciting. Moving on into that action sort of basically takes us on into the next volume where, oh, I forgot something. Sorry. What else is going on the Unital Ring side of things? Again, I think if we're going to use the comparison of this being like a mid-season finale, volume 26, things fall off a little bit on the Unital Ring side. So again, I think it just depends on how big a fan you are of like Silica and Lisbeth and Sinon, especially if you're a fan of Silica, because she gets a lot of showtime in this chapter where she's helping fight like this, essentially like this floor boss. I don't know I forget what they call her in this story, but there's like this floor boss they need to beat in order to move on to, like, deeper into the Unital Ring. And so they have to use their brawn and their minds in order to overcome this boss, and they have to do it without Kirito and Asuna. So they get to kind of gain confidence as their own players, and Silica plays a major role. So it's not nearly the kind of like excitement we saw facing down Mutasina, but it's keeping the story going. I'm not exactly sure when you're reading this, you're not exactly sure where it's going, but things are definitely progressing on the Unital Ring front, even if they're not quite as ahead as they are in the Underworld arc or side of things. And so then in volume 27, Unital Ring 6, this one heavily focuses on Alice. So Alice, she basically was, her home was the Underworld, right? So the Underworld was the main place she knew. So she gets to go back there. They let her stay there longer. She gets to reconnect with her sister Silka, and she gets to learn more details around what's going on. We also get more insight to what's gone on from a broader perspective of what's gone on in the Underworld to date. And we get to see Alice faced with a really challenging question of whether or not she's going to bring back some of the original Integrity Knights. And some of these Integrity Knights we know, like Fanadio, she's a really powerful Integrity Knight and very likable Integrity Knight from the Alicization days, as well as some of the original Integrity Knights we've not met yet. So probably some very powerful Integrity Knights might get reborn and sent into this battle that's coming about essentially between these forces from Admina, led by E-Star, that's coming to wage war on the humans of the Underworld. And it's a pretty tense battle that's happening. We see Aolin facing down these like machine monsters and not really able to keep up because of his physical limitations. We see E-Star kind of gleefully watching, and then eventually we see Kirito come to save the day, as well as Fanadio revived from her frozen state to help and fight off these powerful foes as well. On the Unital Ring front, again, still a bit of a slower paced story on that side of things, not nearly the kind of action. We do see Yui get kidnapped and Kirito go after the kidnappers to save her, and definitely some more world building going on, and more like progressing towards their goal, but nowhere near the same kind of action as we see on the Underworld front. So we'll see if the Unital Ring stuff picks up. I'm sure it will. We'll probably have like another situation where things are going full blast on both the Unital Ring and the Underworld front. But it looks like where we're headed into volume 28 is primarily a battle in the Underworld between these forces from Admina and from the main human realm in the Underworld. So these two are gonna like face it down in some ultimate death match. It should be really cool to see. Hopefully we get to see Kirito battle it out in his like prime state, not just the lower level nerfed version we see in Unital Ring, but him in his like prime Star King powers. And maybe we'll even get to see Asuna come in, because I think she's hopefully making her way to the underworld to help defend it as well. And of course we have Fanadio, so we should see some more fight scenes from her and Alice. It looks like an epic battle that's about to happen between these two different forces. Also, the authors promise in volume 28 that we're going to see a lot more insights into Aolin, and hopefully we'll even learn who Aolin actually is, because the explanation for who he was definitely not super satisfying in the story to date. All that being said, that's everything, all the big broad brushstrokes of what you need to know going into volume 28 that releases in English on July 8th. At the same day, Unital Ring 1 for the manga adaptation is coming out on July 8th as well. So it's definitely a big day for Sword Art Online fans. I'm going to be linking to the full guide that follows the same kind of stuff we talked about here, but it also has links that you can purchase the books from. And of course, purchasing via these links on my website supports the work that I do and helps me keep creating great guides and content like this. So I appreciate you sticking with me for this podcast. Next time we'll be getting back into Union Arena, but I hope that you've enjoyed this little side quest with me. I hope you found it entertaining, and especially if you were wondering what it was that happens in Unital Ring, or if you just wanted a refresher before volume 28 comes out, then this one's for you. Thanks so much. See you next time.